Good morning and welcome to the value session for the Family Business Summit 2020. I am delighted to be joined this morning by Rochelle Clarke, all the way from Holland, to deliver the session. I'm going to let Rochelle introduce herself, but it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Rochelle. Good morning.
Good morning, Paul. It's really good to be here.
And as I said to you just now, actually, values and purpose have been at the core of most of the summit conversations that we've been having over the last 2 weeks. So it'll be really interesting to get a take on whether or not you feel they really matter. I'm sensing I already know the answer, but I'm looking forward to the session. So away we go. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction, Paul, and thank you for the audience. Thank you to the audience for joining. Welcome. My company is Succession Strength, and we focus on communication, governance, and successor preparation for the long-term continuity of families in business. I'm really happy to be here sharing on a surprisingly important but often overlooked topic, values. So I'm really happy to hear, Paul, that in the sessions prior, we have already preempted some of this discussion. Now, in today's session, we will examine what values are, where they belong, and the role they play in businesses. I will touch on the steps that we take to help families define their values for long-term resilience and success. Now, during the presentation, we'll have some audience participation, so please be prepared to submit your responses when that time comes. And as Paul mentioned, I am dialing in from the Netherlands, Amsterdam actually, and the country has just been put back into lockdown. I happen to be working from home as is required. So if you hear little ones in the background, they're not my little ones. They are cute nonetheless, but it's the daycare center that's just next door. The kids are out to play. It's playtime at the moment, but they won't be out for very long. So apologies if you hear a little bit of feedback. But before we begin, let's go shopping, shall we? Now, this is luxury shopping that we'll be doing. You can actually leave your wallets at home, so that's a good thing for many of you. This is actually a tale of two decisions. We have two well-known French companies, both founded at around the same time or within 10 years of each other. Both were family-owned for generations. Both faced challenging times that threatened their survival. Both with successors who had a major decision to make: keep the business and weather the storm, or sell. Now, maybe you see your own family's business in some of these points, but anyway, back to the story. One family kept the business while the other sold. And we'll get back to their fascinating story a little bit later on. Now, let's talk values. What are values and why should they matter? Yes, they certainly help to fill space on the company's website or the about page in the glossy brochure that companies send out. But that's not all. They have a much bigger role to play when it comes to a business. You see, values also dictate the very essence of the business, the way it operates, the decisions that are made, and the business's very own survival at times. Our values are our why. They are our core beliefs, our reason for being. Essentially, they are who we are, and we all have them. Now, in reality, we actually internalize the values of our parents or the dominant culture that we are exposed to, but we are all guided by our values. And that is the important point that I would like us to take away here. We're all guided by, it's almost like the North Star that leads us, our values. Now, ideally, in a world that is free of external influences, our values would shape our identity. But the truth is that very few people create their own identities. They're actually the ones in society, they're actually the ones that society tends to label the rebels or the outcasts, at least initially, right? A person can have many identities at the same time. Think about it. Mother, daughter, sister, or father, brother, son. Or in the business family scenario, particularly if it's the founding generation, owner, manager, family member. Now, each identity has its own meaning and internalized expectations. But why does this matter? Why does this even matter? This matters because we are fiercely loyal to the identity we identify with at the time, and our actions are most usually aligned with that prevailing identity. So, values are not only individual, but they're also very situational. Now, let me ask a question to you, lovely participants. How many of you are parents? And well, you probably know whether you're a parent or not, hopefully, but how many of you are parents? As a parent, you may value safety and security. Safety, certainty, security for your family, right? Another question, how many of you have friends? Hopefully, some of you can count a few friends on your fingers at least, right? As a friend, you may value adventure and spontaneity. Think about the boys' trip or the girls' night out, right? It's the same person, different identity, different values prevailing at the moment, right? So this is something that I would like you to consider. Despite the fact that we may wear multiple hats, the decisions that we make are guided by the values that we are identifying with at the time, right? So if I can say that again, ultimately it matters because the decisions that we make stem from who we think we are, or our identity in the moment. Our values drive our identity, which then drives our decisions. Or in reverse, if we reflect on this, the choices that we make reflect which identity we're identifying with, which of course then reflects the group of values that make up that identity. So in summary, the big glaring takeaway here is that our choices or decisions reflect our values. And families and organizations are made up of many people. Could you imagine the sheer chaos that would ensue if each individual person were allowed to decide for the family or company from their own perspective?
Mm.
Yeah, and I'm smiling because, yes, I'm sure that many of you can identify organizations that we know where that is exactly what's happening at the moment. It's less about an alignment of values that are guiding the decisions, and it's more about the individual decision maker who is making decisions on behalf of that organization. Now, the first question that I have, so in essence, in the organizational context, values that are presented in the form, think about an organization. Values are typically presented in the form of a mission statement or a value statement, correct? That's typically how an organization communicates what their values are and what they stand for. So now this gets to our very first question, and it's a relatively easy one. Does your family's business have a clearly written out statement of what it stands for? And this is a quick yes or no. Does your family's business have a clearly written out statement of what it stands for? I'll let you brew on that, hopefully for not too long, because you should know whether you have a mission statement, right? And I'll get to this quote. I actually like this quote. Now, Roy Disney was the bigger brother of Walt, and he is the less well-known founder of Disney World. And he said, "It's not hard to make decisions when you know what your values are." Again, it is not hard to make decisions when you know what your values are. So my question to you is, have you been struggling, particularly recently, to make decisions as a business? Right? And I say particularly recently because within the environment in which I'm speaking, with the pandemic and impending lockdowns in multiple countries, there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a high emotional charge that is in the air. So all of these typically contribute to a tougher environment for the purpose of decision making. So my question is, have you been struggling as a company when it comes to making those decisions? Now, that first question that I posed should have been relatively easy, right? Now, this one it's probably a little bit tougher, but here we go. How often do you use your defined why, right? Which is your values or your mission statement to make decisions. And you think about it in terms of percentages. It's 0 to 25%, 26 to 50%, 51 to 75%, 76 to 100%. Think about it. About how often do you anticipate your company uses your values or mission statement to make decisions? I'll let you ponder that for just a little bit longer. Okay. All right. Now, I'll get back to the response that you would have indicated mentally in this case, but this diagram actually is a diagram of a relationship spectrum. To the left, it shows individualistic decision-making or individualistic types of relationships, and to the right, it's more about group collaboration. Now, this is not research that is my own, but according to research that's done by Americus Reed, who is a professor at the Wharton School of Business, ideally, you want 76 to 100% of the decisions in the organization to be driven by jointly aligned values. And I'll repeat that. Based on the statistics, based on the research, ideally, you want 76 to 100% of your decisions within the organization to be driven by jointly aligned values. What that means is that your decision making should be driven to the right side of this diagram, more towards the groupthink and cohesion and collaboration for the benefit of the organization. Otherwise, what you will find is that you lose the opportunity to create a powerful connection that essentially underlies the concept of identity loyalty that we spoke about earlier in the presentation. So, given what we know now about decision drivers, we could probably see that if the decision is not aligned with the company or the family's values, then they are more likely to reflect the decision maker's values, because decisions are driven by something, right? And they are driven by values. And if it's not the aligned values of the group, then they are the values of the individual who's making them. So whether you're a family, right, or whether you work on behalf of a family, right, depending on the audience that's here, it's always wise to ensure that you understand the guiding principles in order to minimize misalignments. Right? So this is if you're at the head of the family, or if you find yourself working in a family-owned business, understand what those guiding principles are. Because if you don't, and you're in a decision-making position, what can happen is that you can be in a situation where your values are not in alignment with those of the family. And misalignments happen. Misalignments happen over time. Values may become misaligned, or perhaps they're not well defined at the beginning in the first place, right? Over time, with this misalignment, you find that values no longer become relevant. And this can result in a slowdown of decision making, and of course, at the end of the day, conflict, which is something that we, tend to want to avoid. Now, when you talk about a slowdown in decision making, and when you talk about conflict within an organization, these are usually signs of a misalignment of values. But the good news is, the very good news is, that these can be addressed with some rebaselining. And in order to address a misalignment of values, there are typically 3 steps that we walk through when we work with families in business. Number one, understand the why. What is the why? Before you define your identity, understand why the company exists, what it stands for, what its purpose is. That is the foundation of any values alignment activity. Then, of course, it's conducting an identity audit. Is there misalignment between the actual values that are at play and the stated ones? So is there a misalignment between this glossy mission statement and what is actually being played out in the day-to-day operations of the business? Is the narrative clear and consistent? Is it authentic? Is it being used to make decisions? That is part of the identity audit. And last but not least, it's the actual values realignment sessions to bring everything back into alignment. Doesn't happen overnight, for sure, but it does require commitment, persistence, and input from key stakeholders along the way. Now, How do you maintain values for long-term success? Right? And it's very important to recognize that it's not a one-shot deal. It's not we define our values, okay, they're up there on the wall, we can proceed with life. No, absolutely not. In preparing for long-term success, you need to remember that values are the key driver for decision making. If you remember that, right, you will recognize the importance and remember to keep them up to date, keep these values up to date as the organization progresses, as it gets older. I'll give you an example about a dinner that I was at. Well, seems like it was a very, very long time ago, but it was last year actually, sitting with a very prominent family who was in their third generation. And the member of the younger generation turned to me and she said, "But Rochelle, our grandparents, my grandparents founded this business on very strong Christian values. And they were very big in the church. And this is how we showed our commitment to the community through our service through the church." I said, "Okay, all right." And then she looked at me almost embarrassingly, and her voice dropped a little bit. And she said, very concerned look in her face, she said, "But we don't even go to church." Right? So the question that she was asking is, how are we supposed to identify with these values if the way that we operate in this day and age is completely different from the environment in which the values were created in the first place? Right? Now, in a situation like that, legacy, right, and the initial founding of the values, the initial creation of the values, this is completely in place. So if you look at the way that values progress, right? First of all, it's looking at the past, right? So you take a step in repairing any breaks in identity loyalty, and you rebuild those connections without letting go of legacy. When it comes to this first generation member that I was speaking with, there was no problem with that identity loyalty and legacy. She understood what her family's values are, what the family stood for, and why the family's business was essentially in business. She understood that. That was there. What was missing, however, is the evolution of that core value, that particular core value, to make it relevant for members of the younger generation. Now, if this sort of situation were allowed to go unchecked or unaddressed for too long, what you would see is a buildup of frustration from members of the younger generation, which of course can manifest itself in disengagement and other disruptive behaviors. One area that you may be seeing this is in the whole ESG conversations that are potentially happening now with members of the younger generation who are saying, "But we are not investing in environmental or sustainable causes." And this is where they probably want their money to go, as opposed to members of the older generation who may have given to the church or who may have taken on philanthropic causes. But this disconnect, and this is just one example of the way that this disconnect can happen, but there are, of course, many others, right? But my question to you is, how is this going for your family's business? Are you seeing a sort of disconnect between generations when it comes to some of the key tenets of the business's operations? If you are, then what I would say is, listen, it's perhaps probably an opportunity for you to have a look at the values and ensure that they are still relevant for the members of the family who are sitting around the table. It's almost like football season. Imagine that you're a football coach. Every season, that football coach essentially gets a brand new team. And I say that because while there may be a handful of players who are new, this coach cannot use last season's playbook and expect it to work perfectly for this season. He can't, because the dynamic of the team has changed based on the new players. So he has to create a new playbook that reflects the strengths of the people who are sitting around the table. This is why it's very, very important for members of the organization to really have a look at what's happening presently in the business. And last, but certainly not least, is to focus on the future. Every generation is a custodian of the business. They're a custodian of the business. The business ideally is not meant to die with the generation that is taking the lead, right? What that means is that thought must be given to the next phase of the company or the family's identity. So there are essentially three ways that families should be looking at values. The past the organization's mission, are the values connecting with the legacy of the business. Is that connection there? Is that connection strong? Because that happens to be the company's reason for being. Next, has the organization evolved those values to reflect the members of the organization or the members of the family who are sitting around the table? Very important, because that's where the relevance comes in. And then third, last but not least, is the focus on the future. How are we taking these values into the next generation in a way that is still relevant for the business's operations? Right? Oh, and this is where I would say, for those of you who are preparing for the long term, if it is that this is an area where you think you may need some help, of course, we're offering some complimentary consultations for summit participants. If you mention Family Business Summit participant, and you can you can just send a message to that email that's on the slide, info@successionstrength.com. Just as a benefit for those who are joining the summit, we are offering consultations on this. But back to our story, shall we? We went shopping at the beginning of this, Hermes and Cartier. Now, how did it end? Well, Hermes kept the business and Cartier ended up selling the business. Now, some of you may know this already, but let's have a look at this. Now, it would appear as though the Hermes successors took a collaborative, cohesive, and united stand to signify the importance of remaining and operating independently. So they fought off the advances of LVMH, ensuring that, and they ensured that structures were in place implicitly and explicitly to offer the first right of refusal to family members, right? They were faced with a very tough decision, and there was a coordinated rebuff of LVMH's advances to take over the business. The business is still majority family owned at 65.1%. On the Cartier side of the house, story has it that segments of the business were sold without the knowledge of other shareholding family members who, given the chance, would have appreciated that first right of refusal. So what you have in the Cartier case is an uncoordinated sell-off of elements of the business. And this happened in the fourth generation. So I think, of course, we can't just take a step back and say that, this caused this or that caused that. Correlation certainly does not imply causation, but I am sure that the situation, and I'm sure that the situation is much more nuanced, but I would challenge you, right, to ask yourself this question. If this were your own family, how would your family's members react? Would they come together and make one cohesive decision for the benefit of the family? Or would you see an uncoordinated response where it's every man for him or herself? And that essentially ends our presentation today. I would like you to ponder this. And if the response from that question makes you uncomfortable or uneasy, then what I would say is perhaps have a look at the values. And I recognize that given the current situation, a lot of families are going through a very tough period at the moment. Now may not be the time for a full-on values alignment workshop, but reach out to us for individual tips on how you may be able to still keep an eye on your values so that those can be realigned when the time is right. So I am now completely open for questions. Paul.
Rochelle, that was really interesting, actually, and it does actually put more flesh on the bones in terms of the value proposition and how important it is. One thing that I guess we've talked about before, and it's something I see quite a lot, is a lot of values are determined by organisations, and almost as you mentioned at the front, just either put in a brochure or even painted on a wall. And there's this kind of inherent assumption that those values are going to get embodied by the staff and everything else. What advice would you have to families in business in terms of actually making sure that the values they determine, which they pick and choose or whatever for them, are filtered down appropriately into the staff so that it becomes part of the culture? And how do you manage that disconnect between a word on a wall and your behaviours and patterns of the broader population of staff?
Well, there are two ways that I would answer that, Paul. First of all is ensuring that these values are not created in a silo. When it comes to the business, typically in a values realignment or a values definition workshop, we would also have key members of the business who may or may not also be family members. The purpose of that, of course, is that they are intimately involved in the operations of the business. So they have a vested interest in ensuring that the wants and the desires of the family are translated into their day-to-day operation. So typically we do have some input from key members of the business.
Yeah.
Secondly, it's typically a matter of the family member living and embodying, family members living and embodying those values. So what we say is not only put the values up on the board somewhere, but when you have your annual meetings, when you have meetings where you are sitting down making decisions, it's also good to refer to the message on the board. And you know, sometimes we can sit in meetings and we may roll our eyes when someone lifts their hands and says, yes, but this is not in line with the family's values, or this is not in line with the mission statement. But we need that sort of accountability to ensure that the organization as a whole is operating in alignment with those values. So it's creating, not in a silo. It is also a matter of being held to account to ensure that there is that alignment and that decisions are being driven by these values. And the only way that that's typically done is when other members of the business see that in action.
Okay, no, that's good advice, actually. And you mentioned also that the identity, an individual has multiple hats and juggles multiple roles, but it be a mother, sister, daughter, family member, a shareholder, and maybe even a director of the business. How easy is it for an individual to juggle those responsibilities and those hats with a set of values that will have different inferences based on the role or the identity that they're playing at that moment in time?
Yeah, it's usually quite tough. It's usually quite tough. Which is another reason why we typically say, you know, this role, the role at the head, also needs a lot of support.
Yeah.
Right? So if it's a family member, if your role at the moment is as a family member, that person needs the support of other family members in showing up in the right way for that identity. Right? They're making decisions on behalf of the business and for the business, but with the help of a board of directors, with the help of other family members who are also aligned or completely aligned with what the values are for the business. Because the values for the family may be different from the values for the business.
Yeah.
So that person needs the support of those around to hold them to account to what the prevailing values are for that given identity. And it's no different from the way that we operate within current society, Paul, to be quite honest. For example, if you, okay, I led with the church, and this is certainly not a religious presentation, but because I opened with that, the same person operating in that church environment may operate very differently and align to very different set of behaviors than if they're operating, I don't know, as a mother on the PTA. Right? The expectations there might be a little bit different. May also be different when they step into the boardroom as a board of director, as a director for a company, right? But it's the environment around that helps hold them to account to those values, which is why it's very, very important that you understand what the values are that you are espousing at the moment.
Yeah. I guess that means in terms of, or has inferences for the next generation as well, because obviously they're brought up and they grew up in the family, so they kind of see the family values first and foremost.
Yes.
But once they step out into that business, then there's a whole new set of parameters, and then if they own shares, then becoming a responsible shareholder, there's another set of roles, responsibilities, and then values that are attributed, I guess, to each different facet of the role you take on and become more integrated into that business. So there's a constant learning, I guess, over time. How do you talk to families about making sure they do continue to help the next generation come through and learn the different levels of that, almost like levels of an onion as they take on more responsibility?
You know what, Paul? This actually comes down to the way the family naturally communicates with each other,
Okay.
right? It comes down to how they relate to each other and with each other. What we find is that the most successful business families tend to talk about these things openly and regularly. So when they end up having the conversations about what's happening in the business, it doesn't come as a shock to participants who are sitting around the table,
Yeah.
right? So they don't have to build up to these big conversations because they've been having them all along as a matter of rote. So it could be that it's sitting around the table, the dinner table, and we always want that separation. But this is a way of ingraining or communicating to the younger generation, helping them understand how decisions are made, right? In a very non-threatening way. So it's not sitting them down and saying, this is your lesson for today, but it's just in the conversations.
Yeah.
Values are, sometimes I say values are caught. They are not thought or taught, right? And what I'm trying to say is you can't teach someone to be a generous person. Yes, of course, you can say this is what generosity means and this is what, you know, we adhere to. But in the context of an organization, it's usually much easier for people to mimic what they see, right? So what conversations are happening around the member of that younger, the amount, what conversations are happening around that member of the younger generation, right? What are they seeing their predecessors do? Because it's what you, and you know, you probably have kids, so you probably say, you know, it's not what I say, it's what I do. It's what I, you know, my dad would always say, you know, it's what I say, it's not what I do. Sometimes if his actions were not in alignment with what he was saying, right? But we all know that kids mimic what they see,
Yeah,
right?
they do. It's a really interesting point, actually. I know, I think in the past I've often struggled with the value concept because of probably the professional background I've come from, where it's very easy to use words and put words up on a wall that are just generic words, and people stick to generic words. I'm assuming in terms of some of the families you've worked with, some of the values that are determined are really individual to that family, and there will be some general. I mean, everyone talks about trust and honesty and integrity, but they're just easy to just throw out there and put onto a list. But it's actually then taking those words, isn't it, and actually defining what that means for you as a family and how you want to operate against them. I guess that's the driving principle, not just the word itself.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And when we sit down for a values alignment workshop, it's taking the individual values,
Mm-hmm.
let's say the top 5 values of each individual family member, right? And kind of putting them together. And then as a team, agreeing on what the key top 3 to 5 values are for the family. So they are driven by individual values, but ultimately at the end of the day, there is that alignment
Yeah.
around what the family as a whole will collectively be held to. Does not mean that the individual values automatically go away, because that individual shows up with those values when the time is right and in the right environment. But as a family, we're then able to say, okay, this is what's important to everyone. As a team, this is what we will agree on. But the way that that is translated generation by generation is completely different, as I mentioned before, right? So, but it's completely dependent on the people who are sitting around the table. And I tend to like to give this example about communication. We all value communication, right? It's very important, and we recognize that at the very beginning of time, it was important for us to communicate. Communication started back in the day with one-on-one interactions, right? Maybe drawing on a, I don't know, rock or a stone with with bone, pieces of bone. Then we had carrier pigeons, right? So then they can happen over a much longer distance. Fast forward a couple centuries, we have the telephone coming into play. Oh, fantastic. Now we can speak to people who are much, much further apart. That's great. But Paul, right? You and I are speaking over the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that our value that we place on communication goes away? It certainly doesn't. Generation by generation, it certainly remained very, very important, but the base of it the way that it was executed has completely changed.
Mm.
And of course, within the next generation, it may look even more different from what we are experiencing at the moment. So the core does not change, but the way that we show up, the way that the value is expressed can change. And we have to, one of the major downsides is when members in the family try to fight against this, right? It's almost fighting a losing battle, right? Is what I would say, because change will come. But if you embrace the fact that you are being held by this value and this is your core, this is your reason for being, then you find that there is a loosening of that tight grip on the way that this value is expressed.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I guess going back to the very start of the whole thing was actually family businesses that plan for long-term success, that have a shared vision and a shared purpose and really understand their core values as a family within that business unit have got more chance of succeeding for generations to come. But it has to evolve over time.
Absolutely, it does have to evolve over time. Absolutely. So the root of the tree remains very deep and very strong, right? But it's just like a tree in the wind. You want very deep roots, but you want that flexibility on top when the winds hit. Otherwise, the tree is going to snap and fall over.
Yeah, so it's the application of the value, it's not just a defined thing that's going to be stuck in stone. It evolves, and it's got, as you say, flexibility, which is key.
Precisely.
Rochelle, it's been fascinating listening to you this morning, and actually you've given us a lot of food for thought and in terms of how values can underpin the organisation, but how they need to be lived, eaten and breathed day in, day out for all the generations to come together to plan. So really, really fascinating insight, and I look forward to hearing more from you in the years to come. Keep safe and well. Thank you so much for this morning, and thank you for being part of the Family Business Summit.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Nice to see you. Keep safe and well.
Will do. Take care.